Good morning. I have laryngitis from last night. I was out with the sales team. No, I'm just kidding. Can you hear me okay? You guys awake? Good. I have a bunch of fun stories to tell you about experimentation and creativity and adventure. But before I do that, I'd like to do an experiment on you. Can I experiment on you? You don't have a choice, really. I'm going to experiment on you anyway. So I have a problem right now. I want to do a great job for you. There's something wrong with this room. And what's wrong with the room is that right up front, where I need the most support and help, I have like 5 empty chairs. So my experiment is this. It's an experiment motivation. So I have 5 copies of this book that are signed that are sitting right there. Anyone who wants to move forward, you get a free copy of the book. Just come on up, move forward. They're cheating because they just moved 1 seat over. Let's see the furthest person who'll come. In the back, you got to hurry. You got to hurry. Actually, there's plenty of books up there. Very good. Okay. So what I just did was actually an experiment about motivation and psychology. And we'll come back to this experiment a little bit later. So my name's Scott Berkun. I wrote a book called The Myths of Innovation, and I am a storyteller. So a lot of what I'm going to do this morning is tell you stories and explain why they are important and why they are relevant to some of the things you're going to learn throughout today and hopefully in the future of your life. So my first story has to do with airplanes. So I live in Seattle. I flew in last night. That flight takes about 4 hours the flight takes about 4 hours. It goes about 2,100 miles by air. But if I was going by stagecoach, which is what I would have had to have done when this photo was taken in 1902, it would have taken 2,600 miles. And it would have taken about 3 weeks on a stagecoach. Now this is a photo of the Wright brothers, but it's not the Wright brothers' craft that they're famous for. The craft that they're famous for, that photo is from 1903. This is 1902, and most people don't look at this photo because it's not the historic moment when they actually had their first long-distance powered flight. This is a photo of a prototype. It's a glider. And what is not often told about the backstory behind the Wright brothers is that they were fantastic experimenters. And arguably, they were fantastic testers. Every prototype they made, they tested it. They tried to understand why it worked well, why it didn't, and then they would do another experiment. They studied birds. They studied the history of what at that time was seen as a loony engineering enterprise, human flight. No one thought it could be done. There are legends that went back for hundreds of years, including all the way back to the Greek myths, Icarus, et cetera. No one thought it could be done, but they studied everything that was known. They used that knowledge to help them do experiments and make prototypes, which led to this, which eventually led to a more famous photograph, which is this one, which is actually of their first powered manned flight that went about 100 yards. A fraction of the flight that I took to come here, but 100 yards. Now, what's not often told about this photo, you can see there's a couple people celebrating. We all know now, since, how many of you took an airplane to get to this event? Okay, so this is a part of the history. Oh, by the way, whenever you're complaining about waiting in line or TSA or how terrible it is, imagine having to have flown 1,000 miles on that. That would have been terrible by comparison. But the reason why I show this story is something very important here. Wright brothers, everyone knows about them. Yes, they invented the modern airplane, great. When this airplane landed, so I said it flew about 100 yards. When it landed, there were 5 people there. One was a local newspaper reporter. There were 2 teenagers there and a couple of friends of the Wright brothers. They landed, they celebrated, and nobody cared. There wasn't a major news article. They couldn't get any press for it. It was seen as an irrelevancy. Complete irrelevancy. The Wright brothers actually had to go to Europe to try to promote the idea of an aircraft. And eventually they gained enough notoriety in Europe and the attention of the military in the United States, they came back to America and started to sell airplanes. Most of the inventions in this room have similar backstories to them. We take them for granted. And the history of innovation, you want to understand how to make a new idea develop, how to develop a new idea, make it into a product, into a thing, how to make better software, how to make anything good. It's useful to go back and study these historic examples because we take them for granted. And for us, anytime you're inventing anything, it could even just be writing a new test plan, it could be writing a new piece of software. We have more to learn from these moments before these ideas became famous than we do afterwards. And those are the stories that are in this book, and I'm going to share some of the highlights of those stories with you this morning. Now, I want to start off by trying to upset you or rile you up a little bit. So I'm a writer. I care a lot about words. I think words are important. They're essential to how we communicate with each other. Most industries, including my world, the world of writing about creativity, is filled with terrible jargon. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think, when was the last time that you heard a word in your industry that you didn't understand? It probably happens all the time. Or maybe you're inventing words so other people won't understand them. And anyway, let me come back to this. So I have this theory that I run with, that whoever uses the most jargon in a conversation probably has the least confidence in their actual ideas. Whoever uses the most jargon probably has the least confidence. And my theory for this is simple. Anytime I'm invited to go somewhere, or my own experience making software years ago, anytime I'm invited somewhere and I sit in with a team of people who are making stuff, I listen. I come in and I'm an observer. People ask me, can you help us be more creative? And I just come in and I just listen. And most of the time, the teams that are productive and healthy and doing well, they're using very simple words. They're using words like prototype, experiment, goal, scenario, success, failure. They're using simple words. When I hear people talking about, are you doing the transformational change document today? Have you disrupted the innovation game-changing moment? All of a sudden, I'm like, wait a second. Why would anyone choose to use these words that don't mean very much? So whoever uses the most jargon has the least confidence in their ideas. Now, this is tied to another fancy word, and it's the only other fancy word I'm going to use, which is this word called reification. What reification means is the confusion between the abstract and the real. There's a very famous quote that drives this home. The map is not the territory. I was recently in Hong Kong. I'm supposed to meet a friend for dim sum. He told me where to go. I put it into Google Maps. I'm walking through Hong Kong. I'm looking down, looking up, looking down, looking up. I get to the place where I'm supposed to be. It's supposed to be a dim sum restaurant, and it's a Porsche dealership. I'm standing in front of a Porsche dealership, and I'm looking at my map. Dim sum. And I'm literally looking inside the windows. Is there a dim sum restaurant inside? I don't know, maybe it's something they do in Hong Kong. I don't know, restaurants inside there. The confusion between what the map says, what the words say, and what the reality is. You see this in advertising all the time. King of beers. Budweiser, king of beers. How many of you had a Budweiser? Come on now. I don't mean this morning. I just mean ever. They said Budweiser, king of beers. Now, I've had Budweiser. It's not really that good a beer. To call it the king of beers is even more absurd. It sounds good. The king of beers is something grand. The king of beers? Is there like a government system for beer drinking? There's a king, and there's a queen, and there's a prince of beer. Like, what does that even mean? It doesn't even mean anything. It's reification. There's this abstract idea that sounds good, and you're being distracted away from the reality of what the thing itself is. This is an ad for BlackBerry, or an ad for a BlackBerry. And you see in the ad it says, imagine everything. Imagine everything, which sounds, oh yeah, I wish I could imagine everything. And what they are hinting at is that if you owned a BlackBerry, you could imagine everything. But then when you start to think about it, imagining everything? That seems like really stressful to me. And you couldn't do it anyway, because if you imagine, then you're imagining, and you have to imagine that you're imagining that you're imagining, and on it would go. You can't really imagine it. It doesn't make any sense. Even worse, clearly the people who made the BlackBerry couldn't imagine the iPhone. So they got stuck with what happened to them. So what I'd like to do, just to frame this around, I've used two fancy words. I want to bring this back down a little bit. I'm going to show you pictures of some famous people who in their careers were noted as being innovators. They were noted as being people who transformed and changed the profession that they were in. I'm going to show you pictures. There's just a few of them. And I want you to, this is the one part of my presentation you can just yell stuff out to me. If you know who it is, just yell it out. So who is this? Bob Dylan. Tesla, very good. A lot of people miss this one. This is the giveaway. It's the only one in color. He's missing an ear. I know we're at a tech conference, but you should know who Van Gogh is. This is my curveball for you this morning. Grace Hopper, very good. Now, Grace Hopper invented the first compiler, among other things. And she has a story that she tells about how when she invented the first compiler, this is like in 1951, that nobody saw the purpose, sort of like the Wright brothers. When she invented it and said, look, you can make machines do things other than just arithmetic, they would say, why would we need to do that? Why would we need to do that? People who are in the position of bringing a new idea, regardless of how good it is, are always in the position of having to pitch and persuade other people on the value of the idea. And it's almost a more important skill, or it's maybe equally as important, the ability to develop a new idea, than the ability to convince other people of its value. And we overlook that second characteristic. Who's this? Helen Keller? No. Mary Curie, very good. One of the only people ever in history to get Nobel Prizes in 2 different fields. And this one is another curveball. Thomas Edison. And that's the last one, it's a giveaway. Einstein. So, all these people. I've done research in the history and the biographies of most of these people, and I can tell you again, but the language that they used. They used simple words. They didn't worry about what they were going to label their thing they created. Instead, they focused on solving a problem. They saw a problem, they wanted to go and solve it. If that problem is hard, if you pick a hard problem, by definition, in order to solve it, you're probably going to have to do things other people have not done before. But the reasons why these people have the history or the acclaim that they've earned is because of the things that they made, not the words that they used to describe the things that they made. So I have a bunch of words that I tell people to avoid. Innovation, radical, paradigm shift, transformative, revolutionary, breakthrough, disruptive, and game-changing. These words don't mean anything, or often they are used not to mean anything. You could go to a party and walk up to someone and say, "What do you do?" And they'd say, "I'm working on a cure for cancer." They're telling you about a problem they were trying to solve. Walk up to another person at the party, "What do you do?" "I'm a game-changing, transformative innovator." What does that mean? Well, you know, I mop floors. That's what it means. I transform floors from dirty to clean. These words don't mean anything. And whenever I catch someone in my presence using these words, I ask them, "Can you tell me what any of those words mean?" And usually the answer is no. The word innovation is one of my favorite words to criticize, and yes, I know it is in the title of my book, so I am hypocritical sometimes. If you want to call me on that, totally fine. I hope you get the spirit of what I'm after. But the word innovation is usually used as a placeholder for one of 5 different things. Want to do something that's cool, want to make a lot of money, want to come up with a new idea, want to improve something, want to just sound like I'm doing something of the other 4. And the 5th one is probably the most common usage. In your own organizations, I bet you could count, you'd fill up a whole sheet of paper if in a day you counted how many times that word got used in emails and in newsletters and in marketing material. And that's a signifier generally, forget the context of my talk. Any word that's multisyllabic that gets used that frequently, nobody knows what it means. It's a placeholder. So, when people ask me, okay, fine, you're a critic of words, you use the word in the title of your book, what does innovation actually mean? When I'm forced to give an answer, this is the answer that I give. Innovation is an outcome, significant positive change. It's a result. If I come up with a piece of software that makes your job 10 times easier to do, then it's an innovation. Until then, the software I've made is just an invention. I've created a thing intending to solve a problem. Maybe it's good, maybe it's bad, we don't know yet. It only becomes an innovation once it has successfully achieved that result. Now that's a much higher bar than the way we tend to use the word, and I think it should be. I've already mentioned the names of people who I think qualify as being innovators. Wright brothers, Grace Hopper. These are people who changed their industry. Most of us can't do that in our entire lifetimes. We're unlikely to do that, have that much influence on the world. That bar is super high, and I think it should be reserved. Or maybe not innovation, but some other word should be reserved to people who reach that bar. And that's the problem with language. That's the problem with reification. Anybody can take the word innovation or transformative and use it whenever they want. There's no police, I guess, other than me. There's no police running around saying you can't use the word in that way. I think a much better way to think about this, you want to have great ideas, you want to change your industry, you want to help customers, that's all fantastic. But don't get hung up on the fancy language. There are much better questions you should be asking instead. How do we make this better? What problem are we trying to solve? Who else has tried to solve it, and why didn't their solution work? These are questions that send you on a trajectory, like the Wright brothers, like Grace Hopper, like Bob Dylan, of studying and learning and then experimenting. And that's where new knowledge comes from. That's where progress happens, the willingness to pursue an idea. You don't need fancy language in order to do that. So that's my opening commentary for you. Now I'm going to spend the rest of my opening session with you. I'm going to talk about 3 particular myths of innovation. The book talks about 10 of them. I'm going to talk about 3. They're probably the 3 most accessible and most relevant because they affect everything we do on a daily basis. The first one is the myth of Epiphany. So most of the stories that we hear, including the stories we learn in school about creativity, focus on epiphany moments, eureka moments. The day that someone discovered, hey, now I got the idea for breakfast cereal. Now I got the idea for whatever the thing they became famous for. So the story about the Wright brothers almost always details the moment that they took off and landed, skipping over the part that no one cared when they did it. We talk about those moments. Now, those moments are not really that informative. They don't instruct us very much. The reason why they're so popular is simply because they're fun to tell. They're stories that we like to hear because they're scintillating. Often they involve some kind of drama, some kind of ordinary, everyday drama. So this is a photo, well, it's a painting, it's not a photo, a painting of Isaac Newton. And Isaac Newton is famous for gravity. Discovering gravity. That's what we think that he did. Now, he was alive in the 17th century. For hundreds of years, we had built buildings. The Romans had built aqueducts. The Egyptians had built pyramids. All things that required the understanding of gravity. So that's not actually what he did. Not actually what he was famous for. In the same way is a legend about Columbus, that Columbus proved that the world was round. Not true. Anyone who had sailed for more than a day could see the horizon receding as you went, learned very quickly that the earth was round. The question was, how large is it? That was really the question that was at stake. But in Newton's story, so what Newton actually did, so what's shown here is this pivotal moment, one of the most famous moments of discovery, creativity in Western history anyway. As the legend goes, he was sitting under a tree, he watched an apple fall, and he somehow, because he saw the apple fall, discovered gravity, which makes completely no sense at all. No, it doesn't make any sense when you think about it. And that's the problem with most of these epiphany stories. They're anecdotes, we share them, no one asks a question about how ridiculous they are, and we pretend like we've learned something. So this probably didn't happen, but even if it did, it's not the true story about Isaac Newton. What Isaac Newton became famous for was not discovering gravity. What he did was prove the mathematics for how the system of gravity worked. Why an apple falling is related mathematically through gravity to why the moon moves around the earth and why the planets are around the sun. He created this mathematical treatise. It probably took him about 10 years to do. It's a really thick book called the Principia Mathematica. That's a far less fun, entertaining story to tell. Why is Isaac Newton famous? Because he spent 10 years working really hard, doing hard work. That's not a fun story. Telling the story that Newton saw an apple fall, or in some cases, we've done like the Michael Bay action movie version, and he gets hit on the head by the apple. Who here has heard that version of the story? Yeah, that's a particularly American twist on the story. You won't hear that in Europe or anywhere else. Because it adds drama, it makes it funny, it makes it seem like a joke. It also harkens back to the idea of the muse, that creativity is a force that's external to us. It's out there, and either it hits us or it doesn't. So most of these stories, you also hear stories about how Teflon was invented by accident, or aspartame was invented by accident. You'll hear these stories because it trivializes the whole thing. My advice to you, you want to be more creative, you want to be better at developing ideas. Well, actually, before I do that, I'm going to show you an ad, because these epiphany moments, they live in our culture in all sorts of surprising places. So I think I'm 44 years old. I'm a little bit older than I look. I think I'm older than a bunch of you here. You'll probably remember this little ad from the 70s, and I'm going to show it to you. It's for Reese's Peanut Butter Cups, chocolate and peanut butter. I'm going to show it to you.
Chocolate. Peanut butter.
Hey!
Oh, hey, you got your chocolate and my peanut butter.
Peanut butter on my chocolate.
What? Delicious.
Two great tastes that taste great together. Reese's Peanut Butter Cups. Real milk chocolate, delicious peanut butter.
Reese's Peanut Butter Cups.
And Reese's Crunchy Peanut Butter Cups, topped with chopped peanuts.
Now, the presumption here is that this is how Reese's Peanut Butter Cups were invented. That's what they're telling you here. It's a joke, right? But most of the stories we know, including the history of software development, how things were made, are mostly these sorts of ridiculous stories. I also want to note there's a fun little marketing trick in here. I don't know if you caught it at the end. But you can make anything sound better by saying it's crunchy now. Next version of Microsoft Windows, now crunchy. Worth a try. Reification. If it sounds good, it doesn't have to be good in reality. We're prone to being misguided by words. Now, part of the reason why we like these stories so much, and they will live on and they live on, is something called narrative bias. Narrative bias. We have a whole bunch of these things about how our brains work that are, it's not that they're broken, but they're limited. We're prone to visual bias. We're also prone to cognitive bias in how our brains work. And one of those biases is about stories. We have something called narrative bias. Our brains love stories, a beginning, a middle, and end. We're more likely to be able to remember something as a simple structure, beginning, a middle, and an end. The complicated version of this is we remember simple stories, even if they're false. Simple stories and fun stories. We'll remember them better, even if they're not true, more easily than true stories that are complicated or involved or hard to remember. Now, the simpler version of this, to simplify narrative bias, is that we prefer simple lies to complicated truths. Often, you, as people working in quality assurance, doing any kind of engineering, quality assurance and engineering, often have to give people simple truths they really don't want, complex truths they really don't want to hear, and they prefer the simple lies. You probably deal with this on a daily basis, about narrative and the story people have about why something should or should not be done, why a bug should or should not be fixed. That's a kind of storytelling. And some people are much better at selling that story about an idea than other people are. We're prone to this. You can see this in just all of the literature that we have in the world, the way advertising works, that although snake oil, we all can identify it when other people are falling victim to it, we are all prone to this on our own. And the stories we hear about management, about engineering, about creativity, we're prone to be attracted to the simple-sounding stories, even if they're not true or not going to provide us with the results that we want. This is actually a fantastic book about how our brains work and how that affects decisions that we make, how it affects the way we tell stories. It's a book I recommend to anybody who has a brain and wants to learn how to use it. It's a fantastic book called Brain Rules. It's written by a neuroscientist, and I highly recommend it. It's really a solid book. And unlike many of these books, the last section of the book is actually all the references to support the claims that he makes, and he's open to having those disputed. And because studies, we throw these words around, studies say this, studies say that. Studies are entirely easy to manipulate, and without referencing them, you make it so that your claims can never be tested, which is a mistake. So, this is all great. I'm criticizing American culture, fantastic. My advice to you is simple. Anytime you hear a story about the creation of something, ask what happened before. Newton saw the apple fall. Great, that's how he discovered something. Great. What happened before? What was he doing 5 minutes before? What was he doing the day before? What was he doing a week before? Same thing is true for any invention that you see. A phone that you like, a new testing method that you like, and you're like, I want to develop my own testing method. How was this created? The moment that they came up with the idea is not the important part. It's always what happened before and what happened after. What you'll find whenever you do that, you ask that question, and I give you some examples with the Wright brothers and also with talking about Newton, you'll always find experimentation is what leads up to these discoveries. Someone has to be willing to take risks, which is what, in a way, an experiment is. So I want to show you, I'm going to skip past this. So this is an experiment that you can do. I don't recommend you do it at your own house. Do it at a friend's house, preferably a friend that you don't really want to be friends with anymore. This is what happens. You take a Mentos candy, you put it into Diet Coke. I'm not a chemist. I can't tell you the chemical reaction that goes on, but this is what will happen. It's not really an experiment anymore because we all know, or many of us know, now that you've seen the photo, you know what happens. But to all the children, you can see that by their reaction, an actual experiment is going on. Now, this word experiment, if you only remember one word that I say this morning, experiment is the word I'd like you to remember. Because an experiment's a fantastic word, unlike game-changing, breakthrough, all that stuff. Experiment, by definition, means you are doing something where you are not sure of the outcome. I am not sure of the outcome, and I am doing it on purpose so I can learn something. That is what an experiment is. And you cannot have creativity, you cannot have innovation, however you define it, without experimentation. No inventor, no person who changed their industry, made a great product, solved an important problem, did it without experimentation. And we love the notion, we love this notion of inventorship. It's very independence, it's part of the Western frontier motif. We love to think that everyone loves new ideas. but it's not really true. It's very easy to say that we do. When presented with an experiment done by someone else, we respond in very conservative ways. And I'm going to illustrate this by this picture. So you see there's 7 or 8 children here, and their responses to this experiment are all very different. You look at the child all the way on the right, this young girl. I'm not even sure she's looking at the Coke. She's in her own world. She's just staring at something else. All the way on the left, in the orange shirt, I'll point over here, on the orange shirt, I'm not sure he's awake. He's sort of zoned out. Maybe he's ADHD, he's on Ritalin or something, I don't know. The kid in the middle. Now, he's actually paying attention, and he's looking at this thing blowing up. He's like, hey, that's kind of cool. Let's do this again. See, that's someone who's interested just naturally in experimentation. And that's someone, whenever you have a project, and I'm not saying that we're defined at birth or at 8 or 9 years old and how we're going to be, but we do have our own natural responses to surprises. And if you're interested in creativity, you're interested in developing new ideas, you're going to be surprised a lot. Some people like surprises more than other people do. The kid in the middle, that's the guy I'd want on my team. That's probably the guy I'd want managing my team if my team was about developing new ideas and solving problems that haven't been solved before. I want someone who's comfortable being surprised and actually likes setting things up so that uncertainty happens. A classic problem when organizations decide they take on this charter, our goal for this year is to be more innovative. And then someone shows up to the executive and says, I have a new idea. And the executive realizes, I don't like new ideas. We're going to be new innovative, but not because of any of you. I want to be the innovator, is usually what they say. So managing innovation is a very challenging thing because by definition, you want people who are going to challenge the status quo. And the status quo includes all the structures that you as a manager or executive have worked so hard to put in place. So it's a natural tension that ends up being the challenge of managing, developing new ideas. So experiment is a key word in all of this. And if you go back through history of any great company, you'll find a lot of experimentation went on. They tried doing one thing, they tried doing another. It's not universally true, but it's often true. YouTube, which was a $2 billion acquisition, Google bought them years ago. Video on the web seems like an obvious thing. When they started, they were a different company called Hot or Not. How many of you heard of Hot? No, I won't ask you that. I'll pretend that none of you ever heard of it before. Hot or Not was a website that had a simple premise, which was post photos of people, other people come along and vote, are they hot or not? Ended up being $1 million business. YouTube, the founders of YouTube said, we're going to do a better version of Hot or Not. Instead of being a photo, it's going to be video. That was how they started the company. They started building it. They got funding for this. They started building it. And they realized, you know what? We have this video service we've built, this architecture that can support uploading a video from anywhere. Maybe there's a more universal use for video uploading than Hot or Not. And they switched, they changed the company. So, by the broadest, the startup language, the jargon for this is a pivot. They were going in one direction, and they pivoted into another. For me, in a broader view, it's experimentation. They were willing to do something, they weren't sure of the outcome, and reevaluate it for a different purpose. Okay. That's myth number 1. Myth number 2, about innovation history and our problems with understanding the history of anything. We are terrible at history. Terrible at history of our own industry, terrible at history generally in the world. And I blame this guy. This is who I blame for why we are terrible at history. Now, I don't mean William Shatner. I mean you could blame him, I suppose. But I'm blaming James T. Kirk, the character. Or it's not even specific to him. The whole idea of Star Trek. I'm going to blame all of Star Trek for why we are terrible at history. So you could card your favorite, fine. I blame him. If you're younger and you like the new guy, that's cool. I'm blaming them all. And the reason why I'm blaming them all is very simple. There's this very nice connection between exploration, explorers like Magellan, da Gama, Kirk, explorers and innovators. So an explorer, by definition, here's the map of the world. An explorer says, here's the map that we have. I'm going to go off the map and find good stuff. That's what an explorer says. Well, what does someone who's trying to be creative do or try to solve a problem that's never been solved do? The same thing. Here's the map. Here's the current things that our users do. I want to make it so users can do this. And no one's ever done that before. It's a very similar model. The problem with Star Trek, is that it portrays the realities of exploration. So if you were an explorer, Magellan, da Gama, Cook, whoever your favorite explorer was, what was your day like? Well, you'd go on the boat. You're going out off the map. Day 1, see nothing. Day 2, still saw nothing. Day 3, we're looking back. Can we go home? No, we're going to keep going. Day 4, scurvy breaks out. Day 5, mutiny. It goes on and on. Most explorations don't result in success. They don't. The ones that succeed are the ones we hear about, which is another kind of bias called survivorship bias. You pick up a cover of Fast Company magazine or anyone who covers business culture and creativity. Every story is a success story. Every story. Which makes you think, well, can't be that hard then. Look at all these people who are succeeding. But in reality, there's hundreds to one of explorers who went out there or explorations where they did that actually returned something of value. Where Star Trek comes into play, every Star Trek episode goes something like this. Commercial, they come in, zoop, come out of warp drive, which really cuts on the exploration time, come out of warp drive, hey, we found a planet. Hey, there are people on the planet. Hey, they speak English. Oh, they stole something. Go to commercial. They always find something. Every episode they find something, which sets us up to believe that if we were explorers, we'd find something every day too. We wouldn't need to experiment very much. We'd get it right the first time. That has never happened in the history of innovation or the history of exploration. So this is a map from the 16th century. 16th century map. You can see it's really not very good. It's kind of spread out. It's also warped. You can see how warped it is by what they knew. The areas they knew are really big, and the areas they didn't know, because they didn't know it was there, are much smaller. So I tried to, on this map, the 16th century map, I tried to figure out, are we here? I don't even know. According to this map, we should be swimming right now. That's how bad these maps were. And the goal then was for these explorers to go and fill these things in. So if you actually look at the history of creativity, particularly in examples from the tech sector, most people who try new stuff, it fails. It doesn't work very well. Now, this definition of failure is limited. 90% of startups fail in the first 4 years. That could include failure because they didn't earn enough money to continue the company, but they earned some money. They were successful enough. They could have chosen to continue, but they didn't. 90%. High rate of failure. The same thing is true for new product launches in established companies. High rate of failure is there as well, 80%. You can question these statistics, and I encourage you to do so. Maybe you can find a study that says it's only 40%. It's still a high rate of failure. That's 1 out of 2. You're doing new things. Uncertainty is part of what you are dealing with. Your outcomes are not going to be that predictable. And the last thing tied to this is that outcomes, we like to think the best idea always wins, and that's not true. That's not true. There's many factors involved in a marketplace about why one product or one technology gains adoption over others. The quality of the idea is certainly a large part of that, but how it's marketed, how it's pitched, how it's advertised, who the first client is, what the competitors are doing, these are all factors that have nothing to do with the quality of the idea itself. But the way we look at history, given our immature understanding of history, we always tend to believe that whoever won must have been better. It must have been better because it won. You don't have to look that hard at the history of the tech sector to find examples where this is not really true. The QWERTY keyboard is a fascinating example. It was not designed particularly for efficiency. It was designed to limit speed for certain engineering constraints that had to do with mechanical typewriters. We still have it today. Is it the best keyboard design? No. I'm sure in your own world there are technologies you're forced to work with that really frustrate you. You know of better ones. The best idea does not always win. And that means that if you have an idea, the merit of your idea is not the only determinant about whether it's going to succeed or not. There are other factors, namely persuasion and politics, that you have to contend with. So just to drive home this point about explorers. So this is a list of famous explorers who were successful. Magellan, Amelia Earhart, Ponce de Leon, James Cook. James Cook was actually, the British explorer, was the model for Star Trek. He is why, or the British are why on Star Trek the people in the red shirts die first. Because in the British Navy, the Marines who were on the boats these explorers took would go out when they met a new civilization, wore red jackets. That's where that comes from. Little Star Trek trivia for you. But all these people, Magellan, Amelia Earhart, James Cook, they all died at work. They died at work. Now, you have stressful jobs. You have difficult jobs. Programmers can be terrible to work with and really frustrating. I'm sure you've threatened to kill them. Exploring is dangerous. It is risky. There are things you don't know about that you have to forced to contend with. Magellan's one of my favorites in part because what is Magellan famous for? I'll give you a second try. What is he famous for? Circumnavigating the globe. Okay, some of you are still awake. That's excellent. Magellan is famous for circumnavigating the globe. Guess what? He didn't make it all the way around the world. He died halfway through. He gets credit for it because it was his ambition to do it, but he was killed halfway through. Whether he was killed by a mutiny or killed by people in a culture they met is unclear. But Magellan's a great story because looking back at history, this is the map of the Strait of Magellan. This is where his crew, the actual mission, made it through the continent to get to the other side and make it possible to go all the way around the globe. So we look at this, it's called the Strait of Magellan, wonderful, it's named after him. It seems pretty obvious. I mean, actually, the Strait of Magellan is here. It's this purple path. Seems obvious to us? Sure. Simple. Like, it's really not that inspiring to us because it seems so obvious. But this is not what Magellan actually saw on that day before anyone knew it could be done. What Magellan saw was something more like this. It was a map that, well, what's on the other side? We don't know. Question mark, question mark, question mark. I mean, actually, to be real about it, if you're the person with the idea, and no one else, or not that many people believe in the idea, it looks like this. This is actually what the Strait of Magellan looks like when you enter into it. Now, I don't know about you. I'm not really a sailing person, but I wouldn't be too optimistic at this view that this was going to get me through an entire continent. But that's what it actually looks like. And the history of any person with an idea, this is what it tends to look like. It's uncertain, it's dubious. There are good reasons to ask questions, but someone has to do the experiment. Someone has to be willing to say, I'm going to try, I'm going to do an experiment. I know it's probably going to fail, but I'm going to learn something by the experiment, and I'll be able to do another one. So this is a practical bit of information for you, a technique that you can use. In many ways, quality assurance is based on this, what's called scouting. So what would Magellan or explorers do in this actual situation? They're trying to find the way. They're not sure which way to go. They would scout. One of the reasons why most of these explorations had multiple boats, among others of just extra resources, was it allowed them to separate. So Magellan could go and say, all right, we don't know which way to go. We have to do a couple of simultaneous experiments. You take boat number 1, you go west for 10 days. You take boat number 2, go east. I'll go into the channel for 10 days. Then we'll come back and we'll meet at this point. And we'll discuss what we learned from our experiments. Now, I don't think Magellan would use the word experiment. They'd probably call it scouting. Scouting. It's a one-syllable word, scouting. Who is scouting? Who's scouting out the problem? As the manager, who are you assigning to scouting tasks to learn new things? All of you, in a way, are scouts for coming here today. You're here to scout. You're learning something. You want to meet other people. You want to do things differently. And part of the advice of that should be to actually do that. If you came here with coworkers, you don't want to spend all of your time here with your coworkers because you're not going to meet new people. You're not going to find new ideas at the same velocity you would if you're exploring. And of course, experimentation is risky. Yes, you might meet new people you don't like, but I've met a lot of you so far, and you're all pretty cool people so far. So I recommend that you do that. You'll be following in the footprints or the sail prints of Magellan. Scouting. When you're faced with a tough problem to solve, your obligation is to scout and to recognize you need to do experiments before you can make a decision. So my last story for you has to do with change and our response to change. So this is a famous drawing about the Luddites. Who here has heard the term Luddite? L-U-D-D-I-T, yeah, Luddite. So for those who never heard it before, what a Luddite is, it's someone who resists change. And the reason why that word means what it does is from this story. And as the story goes, there was a gentleman named Ted Ludd, or Ned Ludd, L-U-D. And he was a loom operator. This is Industrial Revolution, Britain, 1860, 1870, somewhere around there. The tech change that was revolutionizing the world was steam power. And up until that change happened, looms, making textiles and fabric, was done by human power. People would push these looms back and forth. It would weave material together to create textiles. When steam power came along, steam power being way more efficient than human labor, the people who own these factories said, well, we don't need these people anymore. Let's get the steam power in. We'll fire all these people and their jobs will go away, but we're more efficient. Well, of course, Ted Ludd, or Ned Ludd, whatever his name was, looked at this and said, wait a second. I'm going to lose my job. He took a sledgehammer. As the theory goes, it's unclear exactly whether there was one person who did this, but took a sledgehammer and destroyed the steam-powered thing. And then his friends saw this and go, hey, that's a good idea. Let's destroy. So that's where the term comes from. They were resisting change. And the word is a negative moniker. It's a negative label. It's a word you say about someone who's resisting progress. You Luddite, you're still using a BlackBerry. Like, come on, get on with it. What we don't do, we tell that story, we feel good about it, we're all, in the future, we're all progressive. We don't look at the story the other way. The other way, I'll tell the story this way, I'll frame it for you. You're all here right now. Imagine that you go back to your job tomorrow or the next day, you show up at work, and you're excited to get, you're all energized from this event today. You show up at work, and you go to your chair, and in your chair there's a black box with a little light on it, red light, boop, boop. It's like something from Star Trek, you know, boop, boop. And your boss comes and goes, hey, welcome back, got some news for you. So you're fired. We've built this box that does your job, that we pay it far less, and it complains a lot less than you do. So you're fired. And by the way, don't go down the street to the other company because they're using them too. So your profession is over. All of us would have a natural, instinctive, violent response to that box. Everybody loves to talk about change, progress, except when you are the victim of it. And all progress has some kind of victim. There's someone who's going to have to do extra work because of every change that happens. I mean, every time some Facebook developer updates the Facebook app, I got to go and do something on my phone. I get really irritated with it. To him is an innovation, or to her is an innovation. To me is at a minimum an inconvenience. When we're talking about innovations that change how people work and take people's jobs away, which most great ideas do, now the dimensions change. And that's the part of the story of creativity and change in organizations that gets left out. Someone's going to be unhappy about change. And until you can address that, the quality of your idea is not the most important thing. One common artifact of this, resistance to change, is manifested in these sayings that you will hear often. I call them idea killers. The most popular ones are the ones that I've listed here. That's not how we do things here. Hey, I have a new quality assurance method. I want us to do test-driven development. I want us to reprioritize where in the conversation about new features where test is going to be considered. Executive says, well, that's a good idea, but that's not what we do here. In many organizations, if the senior person says this, well, that's not what we do here, it sounds definitive. That's not what we do here. But to say that's not what we do here is a completely logical, empty statement. Our plane's going to crash. I'd like to take a parachute and jump out. That's not what we do here. That's not what we do here. We haven't done it in years. That's not what we do. It's a denial of reality to make that statement. Now, a valid statement would be, well, we've considered what you're saying. I understand the problem you want to solve. We're going to solve that problem this other way. Okay, now I'm having a conversation of what the problem is and what the solution might be. That's a real conversation. But anyone who says this is trying to end the conversation. Another end of the conversation, we don't have time. We don't have time for that. We don't have to, I used to be a project manager. I managed developers and designers, and people would come in with crazy, ridiculous features. I go, we don't have time for that. It was the easiest way not to get into a whole discussion with them. We don't have time for that. Of course, I was the person who was choosing what things we had time for. If I wanted to have time for it, we certainly could, but I would never share that. And I remember that, and it's a good thing that you should remember. Anytime you have an idea, and you're talking to an engineer or a manager or an executive, and you say, hey, got this great, we don't have time. Your first question should be, how are we choosing what gets time? How are we choosing what gets time? Now you can have a conversation about how your idea fits into all the others. And he might be right that your idea is not good enough or not important enough compared to other ideas to merit time, but that's an actual intellectual conversation, as opposed to these things which don't actually mean anything. So I have one more story to tell, and I will let you pick what it is. Wow. What about the democratic process, people? Come on now. Eiffel Tower, history of the Eiffel Tower, surprising insight into how hard it was to make, or the history of Post-it notes, or why Post-it notes got invented. Eiffel Tower, raise your hand. Post-it notes. Oh, come on. All right. You're going to see, this is what you missed now. I got to show you all the stuff that you missed. Terrible, terrible. It was so much better than, no, I'm kidding. So the story for Post-it notes. You have to go back to 1920, early 1900s. Young men, entrepreneurs for the time, tech entrepreneurs. The big thing was the industrial age. This is the birth of skyscrapers. If you were interested in technology and you wanted to get ahead, you wanted to do a startup, it was in construction. It was in mineral mining and steel making. So these young men, 3M stands for Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing for good reason. They started as a mining and manufacturing, mostly a mining company. They got money together. They were not wealthy. They got money together. They bought a mine to get this material to use to surface metal, like to shine and polish metal, basically. They built the mine, and then they're digging up stuff, and they realized very quickly, we've made a big mistake. The mineral we thought that we owned property to get is actually the wrong mineral. It's almost worthless. It's like fool's gold. And they had a big meeting, post-mortem in our lingo, postpartum. And they said, what did we learn? Did we learn anything? Like, yeah, we have a much better idea now about how to mine. We can be more specific about what our mine's going to do. So they made a second mine. They got more money together. They had to borrow more money. Second mine. Second mine does better. They were more precise. They didn't make the same mistakes. But they didn't have overnight success. They basically became a sandpaper company. This mineral that they mined was used to create a surface that could be put on different kinds of metal to polish them and make their surfaces smooth. And they did okay, 5 years, 10 years. Still, though, they're in the hot industry and they're doing okay. There's a guy named Richard Drew who is a sandpaper engineer, which was a hot job title to have in 1915.